We have two persons that are remarkable in this field of digital technology. Lucy Bernholz is a PhD in History of Education of Stanford University, and is currently director of the Laboratory of Digital Civil Society. And she is also a researcher from the Philanthropy and Civil Society of the University of Stanford. And for whoever is very much into digital technology, she's in YouTube all over the place. The same thing happens to Brian Behlendorf. He's currently the executive director of Hyperledger. It's a consortium that is linked to the Linux Foundation for the specific, among other things, development of blockchain technology. So we're gonna hear, first of all, your remarks on your topic, Brian, and then Lucy, and then we talk.
Okay. Should I talk up there?
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is an honor to be able to speak at such an event. I'm Brian Behlendorf, as was mentioned. I am executive director of Hyperledger. I've had a career focusing on open technologies in one form or another, from starting something called the Apache Software Foundation back when dinosaurs roamed the web, and putting the first ad banner online, to starting companies that helped other companies build open source software and collaborate and find ways from a technology perspective to put pieces together and build true intellectual property but shared IP to kind of lift all boats. I then took a kind of a sojourn through politics. I worked at the White House for 2 years on open data, open government, and open source software as a way to move forward policy. And then at the World Economic Forum for 2 years as chief technology officer, finally as a venture capitalist for 2 years, and now doing what I do. And I kind of refer to myself as a geek diplomat, in that our job at the Linux Foundation, and then specifically on Hyperledger, is to work with developers who have all sorts of ideas about about what they want to build, and try to help guide them and steer them, almost like air traffic control, right? You know, to kind of converge on a common set, a common family of technologies. And at the same time, talk to their employers, because this isn't about charity. This isn't about selflessness so much as it is about enlightened self-interest on the part of many of these companies, and help them understand how to work together, how to build something of common intellectual property. And in the blockchain space, that means a lot of very interesting different businesses. Companies like you would expect, like IBM and Intel. Companies you might not expect, like Airbus and Daimler. Companies from many parts of the world. In fact, a quarter of the companies involved are actually headquartered in mainland China. So companies like Huawei and Baidu and Wanda. And the use cases are all over the map for blockchain technology as well. Now, when I say the word blockchain, I'm sure at least half of you think that I'm saying the word Bitcoin, right? And Bitcoin is an application of blockchain technology in much the same way, in my opinion, that, say, Google is a company that sits on top of the internet, right? And in many ways, the blockchain technology was more inspiring to me than the make money fast kind of aspect of cryptocurrency. For many people in this space, actually, there were use cases that drew them in. And what I thought I would do to kind of chart a vision of where this technology could help advance democracy, advance the operations of government, and maybe help us understand a kind of a vector towards 2050, is to talk about three distinct use cases, three distinct scenarios where people are starting to deploy proofs of concept, pilots, with using blockchain technology today. And before I begin, I'm sure many of you are asking, so if it's not Bitcoin, if it's not magic internet funny money, what is it? Let me start by saying, in the technology world, we've gotten really good at building central databases, right? I could set up a system on a cluster of hardware in about 15 minutes that could handle terabytes of data a second, millions of transactions a second, and make it possible, perhaps even easy, to build the kind of companies that we see today in the technology industry that have become behemoths, right? Become real monsters at the center of their markets. And I'm a fan of Twitter, you know, admittedly. I use it every day, but it kind of sits as this 800-pound gorilla in the center of the social networking space, right? As technologists, we've built tools that make it easier to build something like Twitter than to do something like make email work better. And you know, maybe I'm old school internet type, but I like the idea of lots of different mail servers exchanging email and exchanging messages rather than all of us using Twitter or Facebook or Gmail. And so for many people working in this space, the question is, could we get back to a world, could we talk about tools that enhance decentralization? Because there's a concern not just about the technology, but the politics and the power that accrues to these 800-pound gorillas, right? And so there has long been in the technology field a study of distributed databases, right? This idea of, instead of one big central database at the center, could we do a replicated database amongst a whole group of people, right? A whole group of organizations, a whole group of nodes on a network, right? And there were a lot of the pieces being put in place, but because all of the financing and attention went to central databases, it was left to academia and research to think about decentralized systems. And to give credit for a moment to the Bitcoin revolution, they did figure out how to actually build at scale a decentralized database, something they called, and I think is a better term for it, which is a decentralized ledger, right? So it turns out, if you approach it not as a database, a collection of files, things that you can delete things from, but instead as a ledger that you can always add entries to, but cannot delete anything written from, then decentralizing that is a lot easier to do. Very much the same way that you're all here in this room today. You're hearing me say these words. Some of you might be writing them down, right? But we all can agree, perhaps, when we leave this room and compare our notes, what was said, right? Especially if there's a recording, the graphic recorder back there, various people with their notes, right? At the heart of a blockchain is this idea of a lot of us running these nodes on a network and broadcasting information to each other and writing down the information that all of us hear and locking them in one at a time, right? And at the end of a cycle, all of us have the same exact data, one after the other. So this is called a distributed ledger. And we use mathematics, we use cryptography to guarantee the integrity of this ledger, one after the other. And it's impossible at that point for anybody to go back and delete what was written in that common ledger, because not only does the math not work out, then the integrity fails, but all of you heard it. And just as today, I can't tell you to forget the fact that my name is Brian Behlendorf. You all remember that now, right? On a distributed ledger, things cannot be deleted. And that sounds a little scary at first, but when you use this as the basis for a financial system, when you use this as the basis to track goods and services, that's incredibly valuable. And in fact, something we haven't had on the internet before. You might have noticed it's rather easy for things to disappear from the internet. So let me walk through three distinct use cases for this distributed ledger concept. The first is about tracing diamonds through the diamond supply chain. And this might sound incredibly specific, but about 20 years ago, there was a lot of political pressure applied by governments in the world and by civil society actors to try to stop the flow of conflict diamonds, what are sometimes called blood diamonds, from the diamond supply chain, right, from the official retail diamond supply chain. And the companies involved in the industry and various governments got together and they came up with something called the Kimberley process for tracing the flow of each individual diamond and each bags of diamonds as they came out of the mine, from the mine all the way to the retail sector. And so if you're a buyer in the industry today, you get this piece of paper with various stamps on it that correlate to paperwork that's been filed with a nonprofit in Antwerp that tells you where this diamond came from. And if you don't have that paperwork, you shouldn't buy that diamond, right? Now, this is a great system in spirit, but it's very difficult for actors in that system to actually verify the integrity of that document, right? You might never have seen these stamps before, these physical stamps. You might have difficulty calling into the organization in Antwerp and asking them to give you a copy of that history. So that industry for the last 2 years, in conjunction with various governments and kind of positive pressure, has been moving to a distributed ledger. And what it means is those businesses run a node on a network. They broadcast transactions. They say this diamond is now moving from this set of hands to this set of hands. They give various characteristics of that diamond, its shape, its color, a unique number that's attached to each diamond. And then it becomes a database, a ledger that everybody in the industry has a copy of. So when they see a diamond that they're offered for sale, they can instantly look up in that database and have high confidence that that diamond, you know, if it's there, that it came from where it claimed, or if it's missing, if it's not there, it might have come from a bad source. And by decentralizing it, you don't have to worry about, you know, because we could easily have built a database at Google that was like the diamond database, and everyone writes to it and looks up from it. But if we did that, we would have opened the possibility of Google or somebody being hacked and that data being changed, for that data to go missing or get corrupted in some way. And by decentralizing that ledger, we all have a copy of it. We can all look at it. The interesting thing, too, is that in the design of this chain, if you propose a transaction, I'm moving this diamond from point A to point B, if there's no record of it having ever been received at point A, the network itself prevents the transaction from being confirmed. So we can use this network to keep fraud from happening in the first place, not just to catch it after the fact, but to keep it happening in the first place. So why are we talking about this in a democracy kind of event? Well, for me, this is an example of the conflicts of public interests, of government interests and business interests, finding a way to take an existing balance of those interests, an existing system, and making it, bringing greater integrity to that system, greater efficiency to that system, with the hopes of getting it implemented. And it plans to go into production this year. Already in test, they've discovered millions of dollars of, let's just say, charitably missing paperwork. But once it goes into production, that represents millions of dollars worth of diamonds that will get stopped from entering the supply chain. So that's really cool. The second use case, and the use case that really kind of drew me into this space, was the concept of land titles, right? How many of you have ever bought or sold property? I don't know what it's like here in Chile, but in the United States, it's actually a very onerous process, right? Lots of signatures, lots of forms, lots of checking with different government offices to find who filed paperwork and when. And in fact, in the States, we pay 1% of the purchase price on something called title insurance, which is nothing more than an insurance company guaranteeing that all the paperwork is there that should be there, right? In a system with a distributed ledger, we can track who owns which properties, and every time that property is sold, was the person with the right to sell that actually selling it and handing it off to the next person. And in that scenario, a title check might be as easy as looking in this database and saying, you know, this property, was it actually handed off to the person selling me this property? Now, this might sound like a trivial example, but in many countries in the world, these databases of who owns what land, in many cases, they didn't even exist previously in countries like India. In other countries in Central America, as they started to centralize these databases, they actually made it easier for corrupt bureaucrats to steal land from people, because they could make a change in a digital database that was centralized that couldn't be seen by the landowner, and where all of the the paper trail that you might have was gone and disappeared, right? And so by doing it digitally, by doing it in a distributed ledger, you open up the opportunity for much greater integrity in that process. And what really is amazing for this is it's what makes it a lot easier for banks and other financial organizations to consider making loans against those properties, because they can see very quickly in a very digitally trustworthy way who owns these properties, what are the rules by which they might be transferred from one party to the other, and we can record a mortgage against that property and lend this person money. Something that was either very expensive to do or not worth doing in many circumstances where that land title system was very poor. So now think about all the other registry functions that governments perform today, right? Simple things like birth and death certificates. In fact, the state of Illinois is experimenting with blockchain technology to record all these types of government documents that you get and certificates about who you are and accomplishments that you've made, that sort of thing. Think about it for all sorts of bureaucratic processes where you've got paperwork that's stuck somewhere in the system, right, being handed off from one bureaucrat to another. If those processes were transparent, and transparent perhaps just to you, but transparent to the right set of parties and enforced using the verification mechanisms in a blockchain, we might end up with possibly more transparent government, but at least more efficient government, and a government that maybe operates more under the rule of law than the rule of fiat or the rule of whim, right? And this leads me to the third example that's being worked with today, which is digital identity, right? I have to admit I don't know the state of digital identity in Chile. I know in the United States we don't have any. Right, we have social security numbers, which are kind of a joke, and previously considered private, but now not. But at the other extreme is India. India has a system called Aadhaar that some of you may have heard of that was turned on a few years ago that gives digital identities based on biometrics, based on fingerprints and retina scans to every Indian citizen. I believe they've enrolled 1.2 of the 1.3 billion Indian citizens. And for hundreds of millions of Indian citizens who previously had no documentation from the government, this has been an opportunity to participate in government services, right? To build an education history, to receive food and shelter assistance, right? To pay taxes, right? To engage, to bring what is a lot of underground economic activity above ground. And it's been tremendously successful for the Indian government, but as a centralized system, it has also created a massive privacy vulnerability that has now come to fore a couple of weeks ago when the central database, basically everybody's identity and all of the details was collected and released, and now for $8 you can buy everybody's digital identity, and it essentially robs them of the ability to use that as private data. And in a model that says we're centralizing it, that's an inherent risk, an inherent problem. So the question has arisen, is there a decentralized way to do digital identity, right? Is there a way to have built something like Aadhaar, something that provides identities for individuals, that doesn't trap them into being just an entry in a giant database, and doesn't just trap and cause the government of India to be in this godlike position over everybody's identity? And the answer comes from a segment of the digital identity community that has worked around a concept called self-sovereign identity. And self-sovereign identity means the root of your identity, the root of who you are in the digital world, comes from a set of facts about you that you can't give up. Things like, you know, your biometrics, a fingerprint, your iris scan, a password or passphrase, perhaps even a set of friends who can recognize you if you ever lose your identity. But the idea is to root at something very local onto your digital devices, something that looks like a wallet, something that looks like a bit of data that you keep very local to you, and then you store connections to that in other systems. So any private data you keep locally, but in the government's ID systems, they can keep a link to your wallet. In the ID systems used by a bank, they can keep a link to you. And you can decide when you want to share information to these networks. And then those other networks can issue certificates to you that might correlate to things like a birth certificate or to your graduation certificate, that sort of thing, and allow you to present those certificates to other places and keep an audit trail of that information that's shared. And this is a concept that is not only going to help decentralize identity networks, this is something that will help meet the demands for greater consumer privacy, data privacy, as we're seeing with the European Union's adoption of something called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations. And so countries are starting to experiment with this. We at Hyperledger have a project called INDI. Hyperledger Indy, which is an implementation of self-sovereign ID systems. The government of the Philippines is doing a project with the 6 largest banks in the Philippines to do a joint financial ID that is self-sovereign, distributed, and it could help the Philippine government get to a system like Aadhaar, but in a way that doesn't put them at the center, right? Which everybody wants a system like that. The Illinois Blockchain Initiative is also working on a project like this. So I'm really hopeful, and part of the reason why at Hyperledger we focus on writing software, on building tools, building systems, is we're ready to get started now. This is not technology that needs to wait for 2050. We can start to make the steps now to take existing government systems, existing government processes, but transforming them into decentralized or minimally centralized systems. That doesn't take away the role of government as how we all work together, how we deliberate. In fact, with digital IDs, it becomes even easier to have provable, trustworthy, deliberative systems. But we need to get started, because I think Silicon Valley and internet technology companies have not really delivered the kind of technology that we need to enhance and improve democracy going forward. And I think this is a class of technologies that will help us get there. Whether or not we're talking about currencies and tokens and getting rich, it's really about this underlying blockchain technology that will help us get there. So thank you.
Thank you. Now, Lucy Bernholz.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you. It's a delight to be here. It's my first time in Chile, and I'm enjoying myself quite a bit so far. I'm here to talk about something that will touch on what Professor Fishkin mentioned and what Brian just mentioned, but I come at these questions from a fairly distinct direction. And most of all, I want to say that I'm actually trained as an historian, so to be talking about something 32 years from now is probably historical malpractice. And the very first thing I want to do is talk about math. So take that for a grain of salt. But for those of us, when I think about democracy, I actually don't spend my time thinking about the ways we make decisions in the strictly political systems, the way we elect our officials. Those are very important questions, and we've got fabulous colleagues working on those. I think more about the way we do our work in what's called civil society, in the space outside of the formal government structure. And for most of us, that's work that is often attributed to nonprofit organizations or foundations like Tribu, or our role as individual citizens coming together to try to make something happen. And what's happened without us really paying a great deal of attention to that over the last decade is that we've digitized it. We've become, in civil society, as dependent on our digital devices as our governments have and as our businesses are. And that is, if I were to ask this room for each of you to take out your cell phones, I imagine there would be nothing but cell phones. Is there anyone in the room who doesn't have a cell phone on them? You and me are probably the only two people. I have Tomas's right now, but other than that, we have become dependent on our digital devices and the ways they operate in fundamental ways, in ways that few of us pay a great deal of attention to, yet that I believe have profound implications both for civil society and for civil society and democracy. So here's the good news. The good news is that as we've digitized our actions, as we go about delivering our services or organizing our protests or counseling our young people or educating our children or providing care to our elderly using digital devices, each of our singular actions have the potential to accrue two benefits. And for anyone who's ever had to account to a funder or had to run a nonprofit and is focused on outcomes, that's pretty good math. But in the digital world, it's not arithmetic. It is not simply a case of 1 + 1 = 2. The reason each digitized action actually has the potential to achieve two benefits is because by working in a digital environment to provide counseling to someone, I no longer just have this singular counseling relationship with that individual, but I create a digital trail that effectively alloys my data collection processes about what I'm doing to my service provision. It becomes one thing. I provide counseling to the young person in crisis, but the digital record is created. And it is the aggregation of those individual digital records that have the potential to become a valuable research tool or a valuable input to policy recommendations. But the reason it's not arithmetic, the reason it's not just simply 1 + 1 = 2, and it is what I call the new social calculus, is because of the nature of that data. It is an extraordinarily precious resource, and Brian touched on a few of the issues that probably many of us in this room have experienced when we begin to recognize just how valuable and insecure that kind of personal data on us is in the digital environment. So yes, there's tremendous potential, having subtly and somewhat craftily rebuilt our civil society actions into a digital environment, but what it requires is a whole new set of skills and a whole new set of ability to manage resources in order to protect that information, in order to accrue benefit and not create harm. So what is digital civil society? This is the term we use to describe what it is we've all started doing without necessarily paying attention to it. The first part of this sentence, the voluntary use of private resources for public benefit, is just a definition of civil society. It's all the ways we as individuals choose to come together and do things that benefit other people, whether that's protest a government action, provide a particular set of services, or simply come together for the benefit of mutual association. But when we do it in the digital age, there are two new things we need to account for. We can't continue to just act as if doing things in the digital world is the same as doing them in the analog world. And the reason this became a concern to me in the connection between my work and democracy was I realized about 5 years ago when we first started the lab at Stanford that in fact, at least in the US, the advent of social media and internet access and reliable broadband access and a supercomputer in our pocket had been marketed to us all relentlessly as the great democratization of our system, of our life, of the media, of our ability to protest and our ability to have our voices heard. Yet all around me, looking at research such as that by Professor Fishkin and others, all we see are democracies under siege. So something just didn't make sense. There's a fundamental puzzle between the pervasiveness of our dependence on these digital tools and the fact that democracy in 109 countries, as reported by Freedom House just this year, shows that they're in decline. So what is it about digital that might possibly be contributing to that? Not to say that it's causing it, but is it contributing it? And I realized that I had to get much deeper into understanding digital than I ever thought I would as an historian. So I offer you a metaphor, because I'm not a computer scientist, nor do I play one on TV. But if you think about what happens when we digitize information, when we digitize anything, from these papers to the content of the emails and the text messages that Tomas has now handed me ownership of, the content stays the same. It's like H2O. It can be held in an ice cube, it can be held in liquid, and it can be heated up and turned into steam, in which case it actually becomes very powerful, but also very difficult to hold on to. Digitized information is steam. Usually, oh, I actually have a prop. We've built this is very nice, whoever left this here. We've built civil society, however, with institutions that work the way this glass does. It works very nicely to hold the liquid. Were I to heat this glass up and the water were to turn to steam, the glass becomes essentially useless. And that's what's happening for us in civil society. Our organizations are not yet useless, but they need to learn to understand and manage a whole new resource in order to accrue those two benefits from their singular actions. We need to learn how to manage steam for good and not just take it for granted. There's another part of the digital ecosystem, the digital economy, that I had to learn about as I was trying to answer my basic question of why were we being told that these tools were democratizing, yet democracy was dying. And that has to do with the nature of the infrastructure over which the steam or the data actually travel. And that's because most of the system, almost all of the system, with the exception of that which can be accessed by a tiny percentage of the population, a very technologically skilled elite, are tools that we as individual citizens use to interact with the digital world are built by companies and monitored by governments. I happen to be based at Stanford, so most of those companies are my neighbors, and because I'm a US citizen, even if it's not your government, it's mine. So, why does that matter? Why does it matter that when we operate in digital space, we are playing in the sandbox, we are dependent upon tools that are entirely commercial and/or government monitored? Well, that takes me to democracy. Because my original understanding of democracy, which is nowhere as deep as Professor Fishkin's or Professor Landamore's, is based on an understanding of a system that has at least three parts that are related to each other, but they have distinct responsibilities. Those three parts are the way that we operate in the marketplace, the way we operate in relationship as citizens to our elected governments, which is what we've heard a bit about today, and the way we operate in civil society, and that these are three distinct spheres that operate together, but they each have a certain set of responsibilities. This has not actually been true for at least most of my lifetime. There's always been an amount of blurring and blending that's been going on between not-for-profit organizations trying to earn revenue and businesses that produce some kind of social good, and governments getting engaged in providing innovation funds and things like that, in which the sort of what we thought were the clear roles might not be so clear. But in the digital age, I thought there were three pictures. In the digital age, it's been exacerbated by the fact that that third sector, that civil society sector, the space that I think about, is dependent on a commercial and government surveilled space. There is, as I like to say, no park benches on the internet. There's no place, unless you're quite skilled technologically, to have a private conversation or to organize to take some action, or even to organize to ally with your government without that conversation being, in fact, overseen by some other set of sources. So how then can we, or maybe I should ask, can we create technologies that actually benefit democracy? I don't have answers for you, but I wanted to figure out exactly, first of all, what is it about civil society that we actually need to protect? If it's disappearing, what is it that we want to get back? And this work is ongoing, but in the course of it, going right to the definition I gave you in the beginning, the voluntary use of private resources for public benefit, we can identify four very important values that perhaps we can start thinking about building technology for. And in fact, many people have been building technology in this way for a long time. Those values, if you can't see the screen, are permission, privacy, openness, and pluralism. And my work goes into some depth on all of them. And they're not exclusive to civil society, but I think that they help us to understand what it is, particularly on civil society, that we need to be using technologies for and perhaps building them specifically to this point. So, oh, this is an old slide deck, okay. Never mind, we're going to go back to this. So there's three things I think we need. There's how many examples are there, since that's not the right slide deck? There are four things I want to say about building technology and using digital technologies in pursuit of democratic practice. The first one is that we really need to create new ways to design democratic systems and design systems democratically. That is, we need to design our technologies for the purposes of democracy, not repurpose technologies that were built for some other purpose. And we need to make those design processes themselves more democratic and more inclusive. I said jokingly to Brian earlier, but I think this sort of sums it up. If Microsoft Word had been designed even remotely democratically, no one would have to press Control-Alt-Delete to get out of the system. That is a superficial way of thinking about how different the process needs to be. Secondly, let me talk a little bit about blockchain, and Brian is the expert and has given you quite a bit of insight. What I think is very important about the current possibilities of the blockchain is that you can't have a real conversation about blockchain without talking about the governance processes around the technology. Who decides what can be written and where the ledger's going to live, and who has decisions over how things are going to be proven and how they're going to be verified? You have to have build a meaningful process of decision-making around the technology in order to deploy it. Blockchain may be, for all I know, the basis of our lives by 2050. It may not be. But what I hope will be are technologies, digital tools that all of us understand as well as the two Brians in the room do. Because in order for our democratic governance systems to operate, we citizens need to be able to understand them. We need to be able to scrutinize them, and we need to be able to hold them to account. Those are fundamental responsibilities in democracies. And as our democracies become more and more dependent on these tools, we need to be able to do that with the tools as well. It's very weird to have one slide deck in front of me and one slide deck up there. I've got another picture of a software system that was built in the Northwest Territories of Australia by an Aboriginal community to protect its cultural heritage. And I bring it up because it is not only the blockchain that can be built to exactly mirror the values of a community. In Wadi or Northern Territories, there is a community of Aboriginal groups that came together, and using very low-cost software, Raspberry Pi servers, and Arduino coding, they built an entire management system that mimics the traditional wisdom and knowledge practices of the community into the system to preserve the artifacts and distribute them, to Brian's point, from both the local museum, which being located where it is very vulnerable to climate change, and also to repositories in Sydney and elsewhere. The entire process was built around the cultural norms of accessing information that the community itself was trying to save. That's another example of matching your codes, your governance codes, with your software codes. And then finally, I'd like to point to some work being done by a colleague of mine, Jessica Feldman, which looks at the relationship, the iterative relationship that has been happening just in the last 5 or 6 years between the movement of the squares, so the Tahrir Square and the Occupy movement and Nui Dabu, where people gather in places to protest their certain systems. And in doing so, they create communication mechanisms that allow large bodies of people that don't have access to microphones to communicate with one another. And they're built around consensus decision-making principles. And over the course of these many years of these different movements, which have been happening all around the world, involving different people, in between them has been the development of software tools such as Lumio, which take the practices from the face-to-face deliberative gatherings and public assemblies and try to mimic them in digital technologies. And what we're seeing over time, and here's where my being a historian comes in handy, is you see a certain set of practices tried in person, embodied in software code, and then the next group has access to the software code and the contingencies of that specific place, and they bring them back and try them in person, and the software code changes and goes on. And I think it's that iteration, that feedback between person-to-person values of democratic deliberation and software development that I think, whether it's built on the blockchain or not, is what's going to be our norm in 2050. Finally, in order to get there, there are 4 areas of work that need to happen simultaneously. We have to make progress on what I think of as the 4 codes. The first one is software code. And that work is happening and has actually been happening for decades. Software coders trying to design software built and hardware built for purposes other than simply making money, centralizing power, and doing a lot of the things that have in fact happened. There's great potential in the world of coding. But we also need to change how our organizations work. We need to change our organizational codes. We need to change our legal codes about how we value digital data and who gets to own it and manage it, and to whom the financial value accrues. And we need to change our individual practices. Each and every one of us needs to become significantly more attuned to and smarter about how it is that we use these devices and we operate in the digital world every day, because it's those practices that we carry into civil society. And if we can't change them on our own level, we're going to have a hard time changing them at a collective level. Thank you very much.
Well, my first question goes to both of you. I have to quote an Italian writer, Alessandro Barico. Alessandro Barico, in his book, The Barbarians, placed a question about change. He says, more or less, I'm paraphrasing him, in the vortex of everyday change, what will be those things and actions we will treasure and long not to change, wanting them to remain as they are, be eternal? When we are changing, for example, the way we probably will vote in the future, how about the experience of voting? How about all the things that, you know, encompass the act of voting, how people will react to that?
So the question is, what needs to stay the same?
Exactly.
I think there's a great deal of work that's been done on what it is about democracy in particular that we're trying to extend into what I think of as a digitized future. Some of those things, and I'm not sure that any of them have actually to do with voting. I think it has to do with a set of human rights, the rule of law, due process, a form of response. But it's a wonderful question, because in trying to come up with the 4 values to define digital civil society, it's what we did there. What was the purpose of civil society and democracy? Is it about nonprofit institutions and tax deductions, or is it about pluralism? So identifying those values, I think probably Hélène and Jim can do a better job, but I think some of those are the basics. And I think because voting is what we associate with democracy, that's probably blinding us to some of the futures we could imagine.
Yeah, I could add to Brian that there are things that are related to democracy that are essentially physically present. Town halls meetings, PTA meetings, all kinds of things that put people together. How is there the risk of turning that into huge video chats or something?
I think a lot about the word trust, right? And trust in the system to actually work the way it's supposed to work. Trust in leaders to carry forward, you know, the work of the people who elected, of the nation that they represent, or the group that they represent. But trust in your neighbors to also perform kind of their role as neighbors. Trust, there's a survey that's been done every year for the last 30 years or so by a research firm called Edelman that has been called the Trust Survey, where they asked people, you know, describe your trust in all sorts of kind of categories of work, you know, politician, businessmen, lawyers, right, as well as in brands, you know, like your trust in Coca-Cola, right, and they have found across the board in every sector, every type of job, every brand, trust has declined sequentially over the course of the time they've been looking at this. So we have this era of declining trust in institutions, in each other, really. I think part of that might be because of digitalization, you know, the more distance between us, you know, when we interact with somebody only through a screen, we don't have the same basis for trusting them that we might have when we look them in the eye, when we share a meal with them, right? That sort of thing. And so in terms of preserving something, I think in some ways, a lot of the interest in blockchain technology and some of these newer approaches is how do we generate new forms of trust, right? How do we rest assured that when a fact is recorded, it can't be challenged later as fake news, right? Or erased digitally in a way that we can be, we can lose all sign of. So I think if we lose trust as a society, in this pernicious, widespread way, a lot of things break down. And that's where I'm hoping some of these tools help us keep that level, perhaps even increase the reservoir of trust that makes societies possible.
The idea of the digitalization gives this image of objectivity more than words. I mean, if you are into digital, you probably are into zeros and ones, and that's more trustworthy than interpretations of words. But at the same time, you create a system with the ideas of human beings creating them. So how do you translate into digitalization the same, maybe, biases you have as a normal human being?
I think any system of governance that we look at for digitalization, we can't forget the human in it, and the humans kind of need to stay in control. But I think we can think of any governance organization, governance system as a mix of human governance, human leadership, the deliberative democracy side, the conversations and such, and algorithmic governance. Right? Algorithmic governance to date has meant depending upon faceless, nameless corporations or software systems that there's very little interaction that you might have as an individual. But I've lived in the open source software world now for 25 years, where software that I use as an individual, I've been able to inspect the underlying source code, I've been able to modify, and maybe I don't modify all the software I use, but I know others who do, right? Or know others who can get inside that and help verify, is there a bug? Is there some way to improve it, right? So I do think the open source software community gave us a template for being able to find ways to make those systems accountable and to implement this kind of algorithmic governance. And I'll bring that again back to the blockchain world, where that system that in the blockchain keeps that same person from selling that same diamond twice, right? Or trying to sell the house twice, right? Something that's called, in technical terms, the prevention of double spend, right? This is a way of guaranteeing that the rules that are devised by humans, by us as individuals, get built into the system and kept from ever happening, those bad conditions happening in the first place. The more that we can automate, the more that we can algorithmatize in general, the more that we can make auditable, right? The more flexibility we might build on top, and more comprehensive we make. But there's, I think, others who believe we could do that for all governance and leave the humans out. And I think most people realize you need that complementary kind of binary system.
I would just pick up right on that. I think it's this episodic relationship between the human input and what can be automated. I'm much more of a skeptic about what should be automated than what could be automated. I think there's a tremendous value, speaking from the United States, I don't want to assume this about Chile, but two words that you hear thrown around in the US all the time as if they were universal goods are scale and efficiency. And they are important values, particularly if you're running a business or perhaps if you're building a software system. But there's nothing more inefficient than democracy. And then there's a whole other set of values at stake for us as humans. And so it's bringing those other values up front and keeping them there, whether those values are truth, beauty, and justice, or the ability to scrutinize the systems that we are using to make decisions about governing ourselves. And that's what sunlight laws and transparency and reporting and open, anonymous elections and open verifiable elections in the paper age, that's what those technologies are about. And as we bring in digital technologies, we need to maintain those set of values to also be able to scrutinize and audit. Now, most of us are never going to be able to look at open source code the way Brian is. I could look at a set of software code and it's software code. But we do, if we're going to be using it for public purposes, for governance purposes, then the thing we need to design, the metaphor of designing the new glass to hold the steam, we need to design the new process that's going to hold that decision-making power that we are vesting into that automated process.
Yeah. You step ahead of a question I was going to ask, but it's interesting. most of us that use technology every day are users. Yeah, so we don't understand what's behind it. We have to trust, just like we have to trust everything else. We have to trust that there are some other people that know. How social technological society needs to change the standard in terms of digital education in order to be actually in control of surveying the authority.
So I suppose this is the question where you think I'm going to say everybody should learn how to software code. I'm not. I want to make it clear that the reason we don't know why our devices work is because you can't sell 1 billion iPhones if anybody needs to know how they work, right? There are business incentives to design the materials that we use that are designed to make it seem like magic and no, you don't have to understand this. So that's how you sell 1 billion iPhones, is by making it so that no one ever has to know how they work. I think there's a kind of self-scrutiny that's possible and warranted, that each of us is responsible for in thinking about what we do with these devices. But I also want to go to your point about once it's digitized, it seems like truth. I think there's a process by which certainly once things are quantified, we were talking about this earlier, people tend to think, oh, that's statistics, therefore it means something. And we've made all kinds of mistakes because we don't understand basic statistics well enough. It has nothing to do with digital. One of the interesting things that's possible is we now live in a world in which young children play far too much with screens, is that they are learning by experience that nothing you see on those screens can't be changed. Because that's what they're doing. They're putting the music to the picture of the cat and they're making a cat video. They just made it. They know, they're learning that it's a different kind of thing. Now, I'm not saying it's going to inherently build trust. I just think that there's a degree to which it doesn't seem like it just what appears is what is, because there is more engagement in being able to mix and match some of the pieces.
So there are things about the technology industry that do favor scale, right? That do favor one company. It's not 10 times as hard to make 1 billion devices as it is to make 100 million. It's maybe twice as hard, right? Or half again as hard. But in addition to 1 billion iPhones, there are something like 8 billion, 10 billion Android phones. Mm-hmm. And Android, inside its kernel, inside the center of Android, is an open source operating system called Linux, right? Also on many of the servers in the cloud computing environment. And while I wouldn't come to you, all of you and say all of you need to code, although I actually bet if you count working with spreadsheets, many of you are coders. If you count working with graphic design tools, many of you are coders. I do think there's a real difference between software delivered to you as a closed kind of thing that you can't poke inside of as a black box, and software that's delivered as a white box. And not that every one of you would poke inside that box and see how it works, but even if 1 in a million of you did, right, that would still be 6,000 or 8,000 people in the world who would be poking inside that box, looking for bugs, maybe if they found a bug, fixing them, right? And that's how the open source community works. And even if I don't look inside the code running on my phone or my laptop, I know that there are other people challenging it, finding bugs. And in fact, it's when you, like the Intel bug, for example, that was discovered called Meltdown, and another one called Spectre, is in code that no one could look inside of. No one could challenge. They had to reverse engineer from the outside and try different things and discover that it was there. In the open source world, we are finding these bugs and fixing them, but only if we have enough people doing this. So I think that's a call to arms to use technologies, even if they're more expensive, even if they require more training and more investment in education in national universities in countries like Chile, in software development, so that you have some of those 1 in a million people everywhere, right? To use technologies that are open source and decentralized at the same time. And again, that's part of the blockchain vision that kind of is decentralization, but it's empowerment. It's about saying, don't just use Uber, right? Don't just use Gmail. Use systems that are more grassroots, more bottoms up, more decentralized.
Can I add one more thing here? Because there's a lot of educational research that says children who are raised in bilingual homes, not only do they grow up speaking 2 languages, and maybe languages are easier for them to learn over time, but they tend to have higher facility with abstract thinking. And I think that's because for a kid learning to speak English and French at home, there are two words for this glass. So it can't be a concretely always and forever known as one thing. That's not a scientific interpretation of the science, by the way. That's just how I understand it. But I think when it comes to software, just as earlier today, the head of the AAAS was talking about how science is important to know the scientific method. Being able to understand some of the abstractions that coders go through, or that someone speaking another language goes through, is the skill that I think that we can all carry. So we can get 8,000 new software coders, but we can get how many of us are there? 8 billion, 7 billion of us who are better abstract thinkers and can therefore question what's being presented to us.
Thank you to Lucy and Bran.